Hi, everybody. I can't see or hear anyone, but I'm going to assume that I'm speaking to some people. Thanks a million for tuning in. My name is Ronan Doyle, and I'm a third-year PhD student in NUIG. And as I say, thanks a million for tuning in. It's lovely to get the chance to speak a little bit about what I'm working on at the moment, and with that in mind, yeah, I should say at the beginning actually that I've been told there's a chat function that's operating. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them into the chat box, and I hope there'll be a little bit of time to look at some of those questions or comments at the end of the presentation. So the presentation is titled Ephemerality and IS Research, an interdisciplinary review. And as you might have guessed, it's all around this wonderful topic of ephemerality. So to kick things off, if I can change, now there we go. I'll just give you an overview of the presentation. I'd like to first set this work in the context of my PhD. And I'll just take a couple of slides to do that, and then I'd like to look at the main question that this presentation is posing, which is why ephemerality, or more specifically, why should information systems researchers and indeed all IS stakeholders be interested and engaged with this concept of ephemerality. I'll take you through our structural approach to this interdisciplinary review and set out some of our research questions, or all of our research questions. And then I'll look at some of our initial findings. Actually, when I look at it there on the slide, I think findings really should be inside quotation marks. I'll stress at this point, this is very much a work in progress, a developmental work, and that findings are ongoing and being synthesized. And then finally, I'll outline a couple of the challenges that, at least that I perceive, around this review, and then take us through the next steps, what directions I hope that this work can go in. So just before we get to that PhD context, I just think it's prudent really to set out a definition for ephemeral and for ephemerality. And I've included here two dictionary definitions from Oxford and Merriam-Webster, and all of these dictionary definitions, revolve around variations of the same thing, which is that ephemeral or ephemerality, which can be an adjective or a noun, is all about something lasting or being used for a very short period of time. And I think it's important to put out these dictionary definitions at the beginning, because one of the main problems that our review highlights at this point is that there are problems around the clarity of exactly what ephemeral is, particularly in digitalized or digital contexts. And I'll explain, or try to explain, this problem in a little more depth later on. But for now, just to say that frequently ephemeral is used in IS studies, and indeed in studies around ephemerality and other disciplines, without any kind of qualification or characterization. And very often it seems like an assumption is that we should return to these dictionary definitions to understand how ephemerality is being grounded in various empirical studies. So in terms of the PhD, as I said, I've recently started the third year of my PhD last October, and I'm looking at this theory called liquid modernity, which was developed by a Polish sociologist and philosopher named Zygmunt Bauman. I'm assuming that many of you listening, will not be familiar with Bauman's work, may have no familiarity with it at all. So it might be helpful to know that there are certain parallels between Bauman's work and the work of other sociologists like Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens, particularly when it comes to Beck, maybe his work on risk society, which has been impactful in IS, and indeed in the collaborative work between Beck and Giddens and Scott Lash in developing this theory of reflexive modernity, which has also been used in IS. There are parallels there as well. I mean, these three sociologists, Bauman, Beck, and Giddens, I think it's fair to say they're all canonical, and they're all linked by their view of modernity. For a start, each of them believe that our current phase of modernity is a continuation of modernity as opposed to some alternative like post-modernity. All of them stress to varying degrees uncertainty and instability, and again to varying degrees that any efforts at prediction or control are fundamentally compromised by the ways that modernity is currently unfolding. This is what Giddens calls manufactured uncertainty. And then finally, all three of them share an assumption as well that the key to understanding contemporary social conditions lies in understanding processes of individualization. There are parallels as well between Bauman's work and the work of other well-known sociologists like Manuel Castells and Hartmut Rosa, John Urry, particularly around concepts like network society and social acceleration and mobility as developed by John Urry. And I think that these perspectives might in fact be particularly useful in teasing out some perspectives around ephemerality that don't come through in the IS literature. For Bauman and liquid modernity, he develops his theory around two metaphors, liquidity and solidity. And just to try and put it in a nutshell, solidity is exemplified, at least in the developed world, for Bauman, by an earlier phase of modernity, what he calls solid modernity. And the high point of this period of solid modernity was maybe 100 years ago. You can think of firms and organizations like Ford and General Motors. These are very good examples, early 20th century examples of solid organizations with solidity for Bauman, best characterized by stability. And then liquidity, which characterizes again for Bauman our contemporary social conditions. More than anything else, liquidity is characterized by continual, frequently unpredictable change. And a primary effect of these liquid modern change processes is the continual undermining of solidity. So it's important to say that for Bauman, solidity hasn't disappeared, but it is being continually undermined, whether that be, for example, the solidity of social structures around, for example, the solidity of individual identity, of organizational objectives or strategies, or the boundaries of between academic disciplines. All of these boundaries and structures, which for Bauman were previously solid, are now continually being undermined. So the goal of my PhD is to try and set out a framework of these liquid modern principles that can be used by IS researchers. We've set out an initial framework in paper 1 of the PhD, applying those liquid modern principles in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the role of IS in tackling that pandemic. And now in the second paper, we're focusing in and honing in on the ephemerality concept. Ephemerality is a core component of the liquid modern perspective for Bauman, as well as many other sociologists, like the likes of George Simmel, a major influence on Bauman. Ephemerality it's a signifier of modernity. And for liquid modern scholars, Bauman's theory highlights ephemerality as being, for example, a weakening of social bonds, or a characteristic of instability, a characteristic of the fragility of global interconnection, which is of course facilitated by ICTs and digital technologies. For other scholars, ephemerality is a character, and these are again liquid modern scholars. Ephemerality is a characteristic of this constant urge for innovation and transformation and change. For Hartmut Rosa and his development of the social acceleration theory, ephemerality relates to the fast pace of the liquefaction of social structures. And then finally, just in this last bullet point here on this slide, Bardi and Eckhart in a 2017 paper that's been very well received and is already highly cited, they list ephemerality as one of 3 dimensions in their liquid consumption framework. And for Bardi and Eckhart, excuse me, ephemerality illustrates that relationships in liquid modernity have become much more transactional and much more disposable. So straight away, before we kind of get into the main body of the presentation, I can say that, you know, in our review to date, these are perspectives that certainly don't emerge in the IS literature view of the ephemerality concept. So why ephemerality, and again, why should IS stakeholders be looking at the concept of ephemerality? Well, the first reason I would suggest that that's important is that ephemerality, certainly in recent years, has become highly topical, and our review would suggest that it's that the concept of ephemerality is relevant not only for IS scholars, but for business leaders, for scholars across disciplines, the legal community, governmental regulators, and indeed for broader society. You know, as an example, business leaders, as well as organizational and consumer research scholars, are looking at the role or the nature of ephemerality in areas like marketing, customer communication, in-house communication, organizational teamwork, and data storage, to name, you know, just a few of the areas that ephemerality-related studies are focusing on. Some scholars have suggested that any business making use of a social media platform, which, as we know, is probably the vast proportion of businesses currently, that they'll need to consider both the social and technical nature and functions of ephemerality going forward. And other scholars have suggested that there's been a steep increase in the number of scenarios that require data ephemerality. These include technical scenarios, for example, around storage constraints of connected systems. You know, we might think, particularly in this context, of the predicted growth rates in terms of the Internet of Things and the number of connected devices that we're expecting to come online. Another scenario or area are regulatory scenarios around, for example, freedom of information issues, or around sensitive data such as e-health data. These are other scenarios that can require data ephemerality. And finally, there are social scenarios. And this is a point that, you know, will be repeated a few times throughout the presentation. But again, our review would suggest that, or other studies would suggest that there is an increasing user desire for data ephemerality over data persistence. In other words, data that does not remain permanent, data that disappears over data that is recorded. And then we've Mark Zuckerberg in 2019 writing that ephemeral type social media are by far the fastest growing areas of online communication. For Zuckerberg, the factors influencing this growth are a user desire for enhanced intimacy, a user desire for less permanent records, again, data ephemerality over persistence, and a user desire for more security around financial payments. And as if to corroborate Zuckerberg's comments, the value of Snapchat, an ephemerality-based social media app, has quadrupled since 2019. It's now worth in excess of $100 billion US. I think it's right that when discussing ephemerality that we do focus in initially on social media or ephemerality-based social media platforms. Our review would also show that the vast majority of ephemerality-related work at the moment is taking place in this domain, in the domain of social media platforms. And Snapchat are certainly the real pioneers and the innovators when it came to incorporating ephemerality as a technical feature. They're really the ephemerality instigators and innovators. But here on the left-hand side of this slide, and in fact Telegram on the top of the right-hand column, these are all, you know, these are all applications where ephemerality is utilized as a core feature of the platform. Whereas in more recent times, we have the other, perhaps more traditional social media platforms like Facebook, for example, are also increasingly incorporating ephemeral functions into their platforms. Facebook Vanish, for example, and Instagram Store. Facebook Vanish is ephemerality from swiping up, which automatically deletes content. Instagram Stories and TikTok Stories see content deleted after 24 hours. And then WhatsApp View Once is an ephemeral function introduced by WhatsApp, I think just last August, where recipients of a photo or an image in WhatsApp have one opportunity to view the photo before it disappears. But you know, where these apps utilize ephemerality as a core feature, we might also ask, you know, how ephemeral, for example, is a tweet? How ephemeral is a tweet for the producer of the tweet or for the consumers of the tweet? Might Twitter ephemerality be characterized by the context or the impact of the tweet, or by the user expectation of the impact of the tweet? These are some of the questions that we hope our review will ultimately be able to address. But I say this now because at this point in time, I don't wish to limit our study of ephemerality to only the social media platform context. So just rounding off our points on the topicality of ephemerality. Ephemerality is seen to enable personalization and individualization online. It's also seen to support efforts at self-preservation, particularly self-preservation of one's identity online, and then by proxy is seen to support anonymity online. Studies suggest that ephemerality may also at least partially address concerns around security, privacy, control, and storage. And then there is this, you know, increasing user desire for more authentic forms of digital communication. Again, the idea is that data persistence denies or at least limits the user and communicators being digitally present, that the knowledge that, you know, what we're saying or what we are communicating online may be permanently recorded has an impact on the way that we communicate. Studies are already showing, marketing studies, for example, that there seems to be greater consumer recall from ephemeral advertising content than there is from traditional scheduled, repeated advertising content. And psychology studies suggesting that ephemeral content activates the FOMO, the fear of missing out effect. And then finally, again, a user desire that seems to be increasing is that sharing of content or data online should not necessarily imply co-ownership over the data or the content. And you know, ephemerality doesn't directly solve this problem, but it does offer one potential route around this problem. So those are all of our you know, reasons around the topicality of ephemerality. And you know, now just to state that ephemerality is already a feature of IS research. Now I'm going to counter the point on this slide in the next slide by pointing out that there actually isn't enough research around ephemerality in IS, but it is there, and it does kind of crop up in pretty important context as well, as I'll try to explain. As we've said, social media platforms form the bulk of analysis being done on ephemerality at the moment. One IS scholar, given the fact that social media platforms themselves are relatively new, one IS scholar comments that in the context of social media platforms, ephemerality is emerging as, quote, a whole new principle. But you know, ephemerality has existed even in IS long before social media platforms. I mean, just taking something like random access memory, for example, or internet caches. You know, the data in RAM and internet caches is fundamentally ephemeral. And then a domain within IS that traditionally has looked at ephemerality would be knowledge management. We also see reference to, and this is just on this slide, a selection of some of the studies referencing or looking at ephemerality in IS. We see design knowledge being referred, design knowledge is deemed to have an ephemeral nature. Online communities, online groups have been described as ephemeral in IS studies. And coming down to the last bullet point on this slide, this idea of a characteristic of digital or digital experience, ephemerality, I mean, it describes one of the ways that we experience digital technologies as fleeting, transient interactions, and interactions that we expect or we want to leave no digital trace or digital memory. And where IS scholars like Kalinikos, for example, have pointed to the fundamentally ephemeral nature of all information. For you, and I think this is important, ephemerality is one of three fundamental characteristics of digital, or the experience of digital, in Yu's opinion. And this is, a highly impactful, highly insightful IS paper. And at least for me, in the current IS climate of frequent calls for new theory and new concepts, especially in the context of digitalization or digital transformation, ephemerality being one of three key characteristics of digital suggests to me that it's certainly a concept meriting serious attention in IS. As the counterpoint to that previous slide, there is a relative lack of IS research on the topic of ephemerality. Most of it, as I said, is emerging now in the social media platform context. Maybe one of the reasons, one of the reasons for this lack of research might be the fact that, at least in the social media context, it is an emergent concept. And, ephemerality is quite a woolly, high-level, abstract concept. Mightn't be the stereotypical concept that IS scholars would traditionally engage with. But I would argue that, just in spite of this, that it is actually a particularly suitable concept for IS study, not only for its topicality, which I've mentioned already, but, ephemerality challenges both technical and social standards, technical and social norms. IS is concerned with both the technical and the social. Looking at ephemerality facilitates study of one of IS's core components, which is information and the nature of information. And at a very fundamental level, ephemerality relates to what IS is ostensibly all about, and that is how data are collected and processed and stored and disseminated. And we frequently see in IS studies, and indeed in studies in other domains, that ephemerality is related to concepts like agility and fluidity, flux, speed, acceleration, and transformation. I would argue that having a deeper and more well-defined grasp over exactly what ephemerality is may help us to better account for the processes and impacts of digitalization and digital transformation. There are as well risks, very real and practical risks related to ephemerality. This is a fourth reason for IS researchers to look at the concept, and not really knowing what ephemerality is not going to help us to mitigate those risks. There are technical risks, regulatory and social risks. For example, there are regulatory and corporate compliance concerns around the technical preservation of knowledge. The last point on this slide offers a good illustration of that problem, where we have, for example, Uber employees banning, the Uber CEO banning its employees from using ephemerality-based platforms for any Uber-related business. This arose out of the Waymo versus Uber lawsuit. Waymo brought a lawsuit against Uber and alleged that Uber had carried out theft of trade secrets. in relation to the development of their autonomous driving technology, and that they'd used ephemerality-based apps to leave no digital paper trail of this alleged theft. The lawsuit was ultimately settled out of court for a very large fee, but as we can see, there are very practical organizational implications here associated with ephemerality-based apps. We can also, some studies suggest that ephemerality enables predatory or criminal behavior online, and we've also seen ephemerality-based platforms implicated in US election interference, as outlined in the Mueller report of 2019. Ephemerality is intrinsically temporal, and it has been, well documented that there isn't enough IS research examining time and temporality. And in my view, theories of time and temporality can enrich analysis of digital ephemerality, and indeed vice versa. Ephemerality essentially has a time-bound character, and this may ultimately make its measurability more possible, insofar as if we can identify an ephemeral moment, that moment should have a beginning and an end. A strategy such as Langley's temporal bracketing might be useful in terms of trying to measure ephemerality in this regard. New media scholars cited here have suggested that all social media time is ephemeral. Again, that's not a perspective that emerges in the IS literature. And we also have the suggestion that ephemerality is in itself a temporal challenge to traditional research. It's suggested that the rate of change is such that the range of questions that can be answered using traditional tools are too rigid, or no longer work sufficiently to examine concepts like ephemerality. And then our final reason supporting the study of ephemerality in IS is just to point out that ephemerality is being looked at in numerous other disciplines, and there's a selection of those disciplines here. Many of these disciplines are, could be regarded as sister disciplines for IS, or certainly disciplines where IS has a direct relationship, like organization studies, consumer research, and marketing, for example. And we're seeing really interesting perspectives emerge in these other disciplines. And for example, in psychology and marketing and new media, already scholars are trying to develop mechanisms that may enable measurement of ephemerality. And one last thing to point out here is that in the vast majority of studies, digital technology is common, as I say, to the vast majority of studies. Again, reinforcing the point, I think, that IS scholars should have a particular contribution to make when it comes to the concept of ephemerality. So those are that's our motivation, our reason to look at the concept in the first place, and then just setting out, the problem as we see it emerging from this review. And as I alluded to earlier, the main problem is that there is a lack of clarity around exactly what ephemerality is. As I say, the concept is poorly delineated and defined. Frequently, ephemerality is used merely as an adjective, and no qualification or characterization of the concept is offered in studies. I'd also say that a majority of studies are perhaps, when it comes, and again, this is despite the really interesting findings being presented in many of these studies, but a majority of studies at the moment are, in my view, overtly user-centric. We're looking at the characteristics or the demographics of users, the user rationale for wanting to engage with an ephemerality-based app or platform, the user experience of this type of engagement, and the impact of the experience on behavior. But again, most or a significant proportion of studies are focusing on user characteristics, impacts, and rationale, etc., rather than on the concept itself. And then finally, as I've said, it's often used as an adjective, and then again in brackets at the bottom of this slide in IS studies, for example, we find online communities, experience groups, design knowledge being referred to as ephemeral without actually qualifying or explaining what that means. I've mentioned earlier that ephemerality is related to other concepts like fluidity, flux, and speed, and so on. But again, one of the impacts of not really delineating the characteristics of ephemerality is that ephemerality is currently entangled with these other concepts. So a typical sentence in a study might see ephemerality mentioned along with fluidity in a sentence about digitalization, but no qualification given about what either means. And I think the case of Yu in this highly insightful 2010 paper, where he lists out ephemerality as one of these three fundamental characteristics of digital, is really illustrative, maybe the best illustrative point in this regard for me so far, insofar as he identifies it as being a fundamental characteristic of digital, but doesn't define it, doesn't characterize it. So for the reasons outlined, for its topicality, the way it's being used in IS, and at the same time the lack of IS research around ephemerality, for the related risks, and for the richness of information available in other disciplines, we believe it's important to develop norms around ephemerality. And to do that, we need to have a better grasp of exactly what ephemerality is. In other words, when we say that a digital experience is ephemeral, we need to have a deeper understanding of exactly what that means. So as such, our review is bound by the following assumptions. The first is that the ultimate target of our review is ephemerality in digital context. The second assumption is that our core target audience are IS stakeholders interested in the concept of ephemerality. Thirdly, we assume that an interdisciplinary review of ephemerality will best serve IS stakeholders. And lastly, we assume that foundational characteristics of ephemerality can be categorized or delineated. So I'd like to just briefly take you through our approach to this review and then set out our research questions. And I'm adopting or utilizing this 2011 Smith et al. Paper as a partial template for this review. I feel that their approach to their review is particularly appropriate for ours. They were looking at the concept of privacy, information privacy, which again is, as a concept, is quite hard to nail down and has also been analyzed in multiple disciplines. So they follow, Smith et al. Follow a three-stage review approach, which they adopt from Webster and Watson's review guidelines in 2002. I'll just remind again that I'll describe the three stages and what we're doing, but again, that this is a review in progress, and that all of these stages are being worked on and carried out simultaneously. So stage one is performing a very broad search spanning multiple disciplines, including IS, philosophy, social sciences, and so on. Then I browsed journal databases, a few examples given there. Also looked at specific journal titles like the IS Basket of 8, also, and then targeted high-ranking journals in other domains. And then finally, I've also looked at selected conference proceedings, for example, ISIS. And the keywords utilized in our searches include ephemeral and ephemerality, ephemeral and technology, and ephemeral and digital. And in stage one, we engage with titles and abstracts to see if these can meet our inclusion or exclusion criteria. Then stage two is what Webster and Watson call going backwards, and the objective here is to further broaden the scope by reviewing citations of identified articles to determine additional articles, And then stage 3, again, what Webster and Watson call going forwards, where we use a database, and I've been looking at the Web of Science to identify articles, citing the articles that have been selected. So to date, 68 articles, this presentation and our review to date is based off 68 articles and our book chapters. And just, you know, the objective of our content analysis when looking at these different articles and adding to them, as we will be doing going forward, is a categorization or a typology of definitions for and conceptualizations of ephemerality. We have 3 research questions, and those are research question 1, what is and is not ephemerality? Question 2, what are the relationships between ephemerality and other constructs? And question 3, to what extent does context matter in the relationships between ephemerality and other constructs? So I'll take you through some of our findings so far, and again I'll stress that this is very much work in progress. So what I've done here, as I haven't completed the review or synthesized findings, I'm presenting in 2 tables here and in the next slide what I believe is a representative sample, firstly of IS work around ephemerality, and then in the next slide work from different disciplines. And you know, I'll just try and hone in on, you know, maybe a couple of points of interest on both slides, but I'm happy to come back to them again later on if needs be. So here what we have is kind of you know, reinforcement or confirmation of, you know, studies using the term ephemeral or ephemerality without definition or characterization, or with very basic characterization, and we do find that it is ephemerality-based social media studies that are producing new ways of conceptualizing ephemerality. So in the characteristics row, the italicized text are examples of new concepts, new ways of looking at ephemerality that social media platform analysis has produced. There are problems as well around the definitions. For example, we have you know, a social media platform study here adopting a knowledge management definition for ephemerality, and this might, you know, be problematic insofar as, firstly, the timelines for knowledge management ephemerality and social media platform ephemerality are very different. Knowledge management tending to be much longer, and secondly, in adopting this knowledge management definition for ephemerality, the idea of perception or belief is assumed into the definition, and particularly when we're thinking about the risks associated with ephemerality, the idea that ephemerality might merely be a perception or a belief that a user has could, you know, potentially be very problematic. And just pointing to one last feature on this table, which is at the bottom of the second column, an excerpt there from the second column, that stable and ephemeral types of knowledge can be found in the opposite extremes. And this speaks very clearly to me, particularly in terms of liquid modernity and solid and liquid, and our hopes that a continuum for ephemerality can be established, hopefully through this review. Again, this is what I hope is a representative sample of some of the studies that we've looked at in other disciplines, non-IS disciplines. And as we can see, again, definitions tend to be thin on the ground, and where they appear, they can be quite vague. But what we do see emerging in other disciplines are really interesting perspectives on the characteristics or the ways that ephemerality can be conceptualized. Bardi and Eckhart there in the last column I've mentioned already, and I think Lennon's work as well on establishing ephemerality as a mechanism is particularly interesting, particularly in the context of our ultimate goals for this research. Then here in this slide, this figure is a developmental attempt to establish relationships between ephemerality and other constructs, and also to try and begin to disentangle it from other concepts. So as we see it at the moment, antecedents for ephemeral contexts include an actor or artifact goal for controllability, fluidity in terms of the flow of events that are instantiated in change. Time and temporality is inbuilt in ephemerality in both user expectation and experience, as well as in technical specifications. And then the speed of events has a direct bearing on the rate of change. And the ephemerality context subsequently sees outcomes in other areas or other constructs, including privacy and trust where the outcome might be classed as positive for the user, but simultaneously might have negative outcomes in terms of transparency. And we also see outcomes in other areas like anonymity, regulation, obsolescence, and memory. So again, for me, describing the relationships and maybe disentangling the interdependencies between ephemerality and these constructs is one of our primary goals. Just looking at some of the challenges as I perceive them around this review, and certainly maybe the biggest challenge is around the breadth of the review and the number of disciplines and different areas that the review needs to engage with, particularly for one person, and then this might have follow-on impacts for the robustness of the review. And then secondly, some scholars, some people might argue that delineation of ephemerality might well be counterproductive. Bauman himself, creator of liquid modernity, would more than likely argue this point, that increased categorization, increased solidity is only going to be further undermined. And for some scholars, it may well be best to leave ephemeral defined and characterized quite vaguely, that it needs to be vague and fluid to be able to flow between different categories and different levels of analysis. Just in our final slides, I'd like to just finish with three schematic visualizations of where we hope that this work might be able to go. And the first framework presented here, which is based and adapted from U 2010, is establishing high-level dimensions for ephemerality. So for example, space, in the context of ephemerality, it might be physical space, it might be online space, it might be both. Actors might be human beings, they might be autonomous systems, they might be both, but someone or something must experience ephemerality. Artifacts might be social media platforms or internet caches or a storage system, and time might be long, it might be short, and again, time and temporality directly speaks to the experience of ephemerality. And for me, the starting point of trying to break down what ephemerality is the interrelation of these dimensions, which, again, for me, provide the dimensions for ephemerality. Then bringing it down a level, but still within those dimensions, we aim to categorize and characterize ephemerality so that it might be assessed and even measured. And in the context of what we might call digital or socio-technical ephemerality, we see ephemerality as having both a social and a technical component. So social ephemerality might be determined by analyzing user expectation and experience, where expectation of ephemerality is high and the experience matches the expectation. Social ephemerality is high. And similarly, technical design can provide high technical ephemerality outcomes. But at this point, we're theorizing that each one of expectation, experience, design, and outcome must be in sync, or the level of ephemerality will decrease, will suffer. A very obvious example is that, ephemerality being an expected assumption or perception that is not provided for by technical function or outcome will naturally impact the level of ephemerality. And then finally, and again, finishing up with another simple visualization, we see ephemerality as existing upon a continuum with persistence or permanence at one end, which might be characterized as solid in liquid modern terms, and strong ephemerality at the other end, which might be characterized as liquid, and moving left to right, degrees of ephemerality increase. So the ultimate hope for this review is that we can ultimately provide a categorization of ephemerality that enables location of ephemerality upon this continuum, which again we hope can be of use both to IS researchers and practitioners. I have a couple of slides here of references. And obviously I'm happy to share any of these slides with anyone who's interested in looking at them in more depth. But that is it for my presentation on ephemerality, and I'm looking at the time and perhaps I'm a little early in finishing up, or maybe I was speaking a little quickly, but there are some questions I think in the chat box, so I'm just going to stop sharing and see if I can access those questions. And while I'm doing that, thank you again for listening. So there's a question from Kate, and thanks a million. It strikes me that power and politics are key aspects too. Whoever controls the fleeting presence and disappearance of the ephemeral, fruitful area of research. Many thanks, and thank you very much, Kate. And definitely, power and politics, again, coming back to liquid modernity. For Bauman, one of the key destabilizing impacts of liquid modernity is the fact that there is social, political inequality, and that those in power, whether or not they're governments or increasingly, for example, big tech companies that inadvertently or otherwise are actually increasing the inequalities between people rather than bringing them closer together, as digitalization often claims to do. And there's a comment from Noel as well. Thanks a million, Noel. Using the example you mentioned of digital transformation, is it possible to specify whether ephemerality is something that refers to an attribute of a tool technology, a characteristic of space and time, for example, to transform, or something psychological, an experience or perception we have about being transformed? And again, I'm forgetting the beginning of that point as I get to the end of it. But thanks a million, Noel. I'm going to look at that in more detail definitely afterwards. And I think if I'm just taking the comment, if I'm getting the comment at least partially in first take, I think this is exactly what I'm driving towards with these kind of high-level dimensions of ephemerality. I'm clicking, but I've just realized I'm not sharing the screen anymore, but these high-level dimensions of space, actor, time, and artifact, I think are a very, can possibly be a very good first categorization of the dimensions of ephemerality. That's it, I think. I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm not sure if anyone is still online, but I think that's it for me. It's 10 to 1, so we're all getting out 10 minutes early, but I'll just finish up by saying thanks a million to those who've been here and to anyone who's listened. And as I say, if anyone wants to get in touch and give me a few prods or a few comments or a bit of advice, I'd more than appreciate it. So thanks a million, and take care, everyone. Have a good week.